Hello, welcome viewers. You're watching our special program Democracies of the World on Sansad TV, where we take you through the latest happenings from parliaments across the globe. In today's edition, our top focus will be on ongoing crucial debate on the deadly gun culture, which has returned once again in the United States after a school shooting in Texas, in which 19 children and 2 adults were killed. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll also take you through the parliamentary structure of France and discuss what's at stake in Colombia's upcoming election. I'm your host, BHAWNA. Let's start the program with French parliamentary elections. French voters went to polls this week in the first round of parliamentary elections with all 577 National Assembly seats at play. The left-wing NUPES coalition came out neck and neck with Emmanuel Macron's presidential group, while Marine Le Pen National Rally and the right-wing Republicans trailed behind. Let's take a look at this report.
French voters took to the voting polls on Sunday to elect the National Assembly MPs for a new 5-year term. The first round of the parliamentary election, held less than 2 months after President Emmanuel Macron won his re-election, saw more than 6,000 candidates compete for 577 seats. According to official results, opening round of the election saw Macron's Ensemble coalition take a slight lead with 25.75% of popular vote, compared with 25.66% of the NUPES leftist bloc of Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Far-right and nationalist Rassemblement National, led by Marine Le Pen, who lost to Macron in the second round of presidential elections, came a distant third, receiving 18.68% of the vote. An estimated 52.49% of registered voters did not cast their ballots. Different polls have predicted that Ensemble could get between 255 and 310 seats compared to NUPES' possible range of between 150 and 220 deputies. Take a look at how the legislative elections work in France. Since 2002, when the French switched to a 5-year term for presidency from a 7-year term, legislative elections have been held in the weeks following the presidential election. As a result of this structure, they have been overshadowed by the presidential elections. Legislative elections are unique in that while they occur on a national level, ultimately it is the local level constituency that organizes the vote. Candidates are not chosen from a list but rather directly by their constituencies, like in US elections. Candidates who did not cross the 50% threshold in the first round will now have to go into the second runoff round on Sunday. The closeness of the vote means an ensemble might not keep their absolute majority in parliament, depending on how results go on Sunday. Macron would need to secure at least 289 out of the 577 seats to have a majority for pushing through legislations during his second 5-year term. Bureau Report, Sansad TV.
France is one of the birthplaces of modern democracy. The current French government runs according to the constitution of the Fifth Republic, which was enacted in 1958. It is a republic and a parliamentary democracy and is a hybrid presidential and parliamentary political system. So what is the French parliament? What type of government does France have? And how does it work? Take a look in this detailed report.
The French Parliament is bicameral. The lower chamber is the National Assembly, which sits in the Palais Bourbon with 577 elected deputies. The upper chamber is the Senate, which sits inside the Luxembourg Palace. It has 348 senators elected by an electoral college of representatives. Although the two chambers have similar powers, the National Assembly is the more prominent of the two. The central French government is the main decision-making body in France and oversees policy development in areas such as healthcare, education and public transport. However, there are 3 tiers of government below the national government that perform various administrative and legal functions. France has both a president and a prime minister. The president is the head of the state, the most powerful person in French politics, and generally the most well-known figurehead of the French government. The public elects the president, who usually represents one of the French political parties. It is the responsibility of the French president to appoint a prime minister as head of government. The prime minister is usually the leader of the party or coalition of parties with the most assembly seats, who will then form a new French government. This consists of the Council of Ministers, plus other ministers and secretaries of state. French citizens vote in 4 types of elections: presidential, parliamentary, local, and European. National elections take place every 5 years, whereas local elections are usually every 6 years. Elections are always on a Sunday. All French citizens aged 18 and over can vote in French elections. France is one of only 2 European democracies, the other being the UK, that does not use a form of proportional representation in its elections. The French president and MPs are elected using the 2-round system. If no candidate wins at least 50% of the votes in the first round, then the second round takes place on a different day. In parliamentary elections, 577 MPs are elected in single-seat constituencies. Each voter gets a single vote. Only candidates with the support of at least 12.5% of eligible voters progress to round 2. The winner is then the candidate with the most votes in the second round.
Colombians will head to the polls again in June 19 in what's anticipated to be a close runoff presidential election between 2 anti-establishment candidates, leftist Gustavo Petro and conservative populist Rodolfo Hernández. It is a crucial time for the country with growing numbers of Colombians facing poverty, extreme income inequality and a resurgence in cartel-related violence. The winner of these elections will replace conservative President Iván Duque, an unpopular leader who endured widespread protest against economic inequality last year. So what will be more of the same in Colombia, or will there be a change? Everything remains to be seen. Take a look.
On June 19th, Colombians are set to vote in a runoff that will determine the future of their country. Presidential elections were held in Colombia on 29th May. As none of the presidential nominees obtained at least 50% of the votes, a runoff will be held on Sunday. Rodolfo Hernández, a billionaire populist and former mayor of the city of Bucaramanga, made a surprise electoral leap in the first round of the May elections, defeating the second favorite in the polls, centre-right candidate Federico Gutiérrez, that qualified him to run for president in the second round. In the first round of the presidential elections held, leftist and progressive candidate Gustavo Petro obtained 40% of the votes, while Rodolfo Hernández reached 28%. Incumbent President Iván Duque was ineligible for a second term. In a sign of how Colombians are rejecting the establishment that has run the country in the past decades, voter will choose between the previously little-known 77-year-old independent Hernández and Petro. Hernández is campaigning against corruption to boost economic growth and finance programs focused on reducing poverty and inequality, generating employment as well as improving education, health and housing for the poorest. Petro, a 62-year-old economist, proposes major economic and social changes. However, some of his initiatives, like suspending new oil exploration contracts, reforming the pension system, ending tax exemptions and raising taxes on the richest, have caused concern among oil companies and miners. Hernández has greater backing between rural voters, while Petro is stronger among younger voters. The vote comes as the Colombian electorate is aching for political change after the country saw enormous nationwide protests last year demanding an end to structural inequalities and police violence. Outgoing conservative President Iván Duque has since seen his popularity plummet, reaching a 73% disapproval rating earlier this year. Colombian presidents are elected for 4-year terms using a 2-round system. If no candidate receives a majority of the vote in the first round, a runoff is held between the 2 top candidates. Bureau Report, Sansad TV.
Moving ahead, in a high-stakes political drama, members of the European Parliament rejected 3 major pieces of climate legislation in a plenary vote in Brussels, delaying EU efforts to reduce carbon emissions by at least 55% by 2030. Political parties had already reached an agreement in the Environmental Committee in May, which pushed for even faster emission reductions in Europe than the EU Commission originally had proposed. But months of careful compromise building came crashing down in a dramatic series of plenary votes when left-wing lawmakers rejected a proposal for reforming the EU's carbon market rather than see it watered down, forming an unexpected majority with the far right. The move, due to intense pressure from industry groups, is likely to delay progress on parts of the EU's mammoth package of climate legislation known as Fit for 55, as it seeks to slash the bloc's emissions by 55% this decade. New negotiations are expected to start in July. And now, plunging the divided nation into political uncertainty, dozens of lawmakers who make up the biggest bloc in the Iraq's parliament resigned on Sunday amid a prolonged political impasse. The 73 lawmakers from powerful Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr's bloc submitted their resignation based on his request to protest a persisting political deadlock 8 months after general elections were held. Parliament Speaker accepted their resignation. Al-Sadr, a maverick leader remembered for leading an insurgency against US forces after the 2003 invasion, emerged as the winner in the election held in October. The election was held several months earlier than expected in response to mass protests that broke out in late 2019 and saw tens of thousands rally against endemic corruption, poor services and unemployment. According to Iraqi laws, if any seat in parliament becomes vacant, the candidate who obtains the second highest number of votes in their electoral district would replace them. Iraq's parliament has passed emergency legislation that will allow the government to use public funds for urgent food security and development needs, as the country had faced a political deadlock since October of last year that has left Iraq without a formal budget. The emergency law for food security and development is meant to allocate $17.14 billion to the government to buy wheat, rice, gas and energy, pay salaries, among other things. The legislation will allow Baghdad to expand food subsidies as the country faces rising prices aggravated by the war in Ukraine and a crippling drought, in addition to boosting electricity provisions as consumption rises leading into the summer. Political disagreement among parties have hindered the election of a president months after an October general election, from which cleric Muqtada al-Sadr emerged as the biggest winner, with his Shiite pro-Iran rivals receiving a hammering at the polls. The failure to elect a president is seen as a setback to Sadr and his alliance, but the passing of the bill is considered a victory for Sadr, who proposed the law. Meanwhile, in Thailand, opposition parties on Wednesday filed a no-confidence motion against Prime Minister and 10 cabinet ministers. They have accused them of graft, economic mismanagement, and of undermining democracy and clinging of power. The opposition expects the censure debate to take place next month and hopes it will bring down Prayut Chan-o-cha 17-party government. It would be the last confidence vote Prayut, 68, will face before his term ends in March next year. Prayut, a retired general who first came to power in 2014 coup, has weathered 3 previous confidence motions since a 2019 election that kept him in power. And slipping into a short break here, on the other side, United States Senate discusses agreement on gun safety, and there'll be much more. All this after this short break. You stay tuned to Sansad TV. Welcome back after the break. You're watching our special program, Democracies of the World. Moving ahead, 2 horrific massacres in recent weeks have succeeded in bringing Democrats and Republicans close to the most significant federal legislation addressing U.S. gun violence in 3 decades. 20 senators, 10 from each party, reached a deal to put through legislation that would tighten some rules on gun sales. Let's take a look at this report.
In a major breakthrough for gun safety advocates, a cross-party group of 20 US senators have agreed to a framework for potential legislation on tightening gun control laws in the United States, bolstering school security and funding more mental health care.
The bill is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
The move is the immediate reaction of 3 mass shootings in New York and Texas, which shook the nation and reignited the debate on the vital issue.
Not one more! Not one more!
Previous attempts to tighten gun laws failed to get the required support in Congress. The bill recommends enhanced background checks for people under 21 buying a gun, allowing a review of juvenile crime and mental health records. Funding and incentives for states to pass red flag laws to keep guns out of the hands of people deemed a danger to themselves or society and perpetrators of domestic abuse. Tougher penalties for straw purchasers of guns for others that feed illegal firearm trafficking. Closing loopholes on gun dealer regulations. Federal support for state investments in school security and mental health programs. But the deal does not include a ban on the sale of rapid-fire assault weapons that have often been the weapon of choice deployed by mass shooters in the US. A ban on gun sales to people under 21, mandatory waiting periods in all gun purchases, and bans on high-capacity magazines. Even so, the gun control groups have welcomed the plan, calling it an important first step in a country that has not seen any major gun control measures passed in decades, despite a continually high rate of gun violence. The group, which includes 10 Republicans, has the 60-vote supermajority needed to assure the yet-to-be-drafted bill would be immune from being blocked in the Senate. Barring any major changes, the potential legislation would likely easily pass in the Democrat-majority House of Representatives and head to President Joe Biden's desk to be signed into law. The Democrat-controlled lower chamber, the House of Representatives, this week voted through a series of measures regulating the sale of guns. But Republican opposition in the Senate means the bill has little chance of entering law, leaving the bipartisan deal agreed on Sunday as the only realistic hope for federal measures to address firearms violence. Meanwhile, the National Rifle Association, which has wielded powerful influence over Republicans for decades, made clear their fundamental opposition.
NRA, how many kids did you kill today?
Congress, we need an assault weapons ban.
Tens of thousands of people are staging protests across the US to call for stricter gun laws in the wake of mass shootings. 3 recent shocking mass killings have drawn widespread attention among many other less publicized assaults that occur weekly in the United States. In one instance, 10 black people were gunned down in a racist-inspired attack at Buffalo in New York grocery store, while 19 school children and their 2 teachers were killed inside an elementary school in Texas, and 4 people shot to death at a Tulsa, Oklahoma medical facility. As per a report by Small Arms Survey, the US comprises less than 5% of the world's population but has more than 46% of civilian-owned guns globally. There have been 213 mass shootings in the US this year alone, of which 27 occurred in schools. Bureau Report, Sansad TV.
And now moving on to Japan, where its parliament on Monday passed legislation making online insults punishable by imprisonment amid rising public concern over cyberbullying sparked by the suicide of a reality television star who had faced social media abuse. Take a look at this report.
In an attempt to quell public concern about cyberbullying, Japan has passed legislation making online insults punishable by imprisonment. The bill passed by the Japanese government on Monday has amended the country's penal code and will take effect this summer. Previously, the maximum penalty for the crime of insultation was less than 30 days detention or a fine of less than $75. The amendment introduces the prison term and increases the maximum fine to 3 lakh yen, about $2,200. The bill proved controversial in the country, with opponents arguing it could impede free speech and criticism of those in power. Under Japan's penal code, insults are defined as publicly demeaning someone's social standing without referring to specific facts about them or a specific action. The crime is different to defamation, defined as publicly demeaning someone while pointing to specific facts. Both are punishable under the law. The issue of online harassment has gained prominence in the past few years, with growing calls for anti-cyberbullying laws after the death of professional wrestler and reality television star Hana Kimura. Kimura, 22, who was known for her role in the Netflix show Terrace House, died by suicide in 2020. The news triggered grief and shock nationwide, with many pointing to online abuse she had received from social media users in the months leading up to her death. Bureau Report, Sansad TV.
Portugal's parliament has tried to introduce a new law allowing euthanasia for the third time in just over a year. The country's constitutional court and the president have blocked two previous bills passed by lawmakers due to unclear wording. 4 rewritten bills that would permit euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide in Portugal were put to a vote in the 230-seat chamber. The proposals were all introduced by left-wing parties, including the ruling Socialist Party of Prime Minister Antonio Costa. The bills will allow a doctor to directly administer fatal drugs to a patient or a patient to administer the lethal drug themselves under medical supervision. President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa is likely to block the legislation once again or send it to the Constitutional Court for vetting. In March 2021, Portugal's top court said the wording of a proposed bill legalizing euthanasia was too imprecise. Rebelo de Sousa then vetoed a second parliament-sanctioned bill last November. The president said further clarification was needed about whether the proposed law would apply only to incurable illness or whether it could be extended to any fatal or serious illness. None of the 4 new bills in parliament addresses Rebelo de Sousa's specific concern. Moving ahead, a former governor of Lagos, Nigeria's largest city, has been nominated to the ruling party's candidate in next year's presidential election. Bola Tinubu, widely referred to as the godfather of Lagos, polled a majority of the votes at the convention of the All Progressives Congress Party. More than 2,300 delegates voted in the convention held in Abuja, the nation's capital. The only female candidate among the 23 aspirants withdrew before the vote. Nigeria's political world remains male-dominated and women rarely make it to the top positions. The presidential election in February 2023 may be two-horse race between Tinubu and Atiku Abubakar, former vice president, who again clinched the nomination of the People's Democratic Party. And a bakery in Kiev has created and named a pastry in honor of Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson for his support in Ukraine's war against Russia. The highlight of the delicacy is that it carries the signature hairdo of Johnson. The bakery explained that the pastry is inspired by the English apple pie and charming haircut of the British Prime Minister. And with all that tempting visuals, that's all we have in this edition of our program on democracies of the world. Connect with us on various social media platforms for all the latest from India and around the world. You can send in your feedback at Sansad TV at sansad.nic.in. Stay tuned for more informative programs on Sansad TV. Till then, goodbye, namaskar.